What do you do when you discover that the woman your son trusts completely has been quietly, methodically, and deliberately dismantling everything he has spent 6 years building? I found out on a Wednesday afternoon at a birthday lunch. 12 women at a table, salads being served, and my neighbor's acquaintance Patricia leaned over and told me she needed to say something sensitive. Her husband Greg worked at Harlow and Reed, the same firm where my son, Daniel, had spent 6 years working his way from site coordinator to the strongest internal candidate for senior project manager his supervisor had seen in years. Patricia said Vanessa had called Greg twice in the past month. Not texted, called. The first time she expressed concern about Daniel's stress levels. The second time she told him Daniel had been drinking before work in the mornings and that she had found bottles hidden in the garage. I kept my face neutral because 12 women were at that table, and I would not make a scene at someone's birthday. But my hands went still on my fork, and my heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. Daniel is 34 years old. He coaches a youth soccer team on Saturday mornings. He comes home and cooks dinner 3 nights a week. He has maybe 2 glasses of wine at Christmas if the conversation calls for it. The idea of him hiding bottles, drinking before his commute, was so far removed from reality that my first instinct was that Patricia had confused him with someone else entirely, but Patricia's face told me she had not confused anyone. Asked if her husband had shared this with people at work. She went quiet in the specific way that answers the question before the words do. She said Marcus Hale, Daniel's direct supervisor, the man who had personally encouraged Daniel to apply for the promotion and told him he was the strongest candidate they had seen in years, had heard about it. Through the office, I drove home with both hands tight on the wheel, going over the timeline in my head. Daniel had submitted his formal application for senior project manager 3 months earlier. Marcus Hale had told him during his review that the promotion was essentially his to lose. A 30% raise. Oversight of the firm's largest accounts. The kind of title that follows a person through an entire career. If the right people believed he had an unmanaged drinking problem, that promotion would disappear without anyone ever having to say why. I sat in my driveway for 15 minutes before I went inside. Part of me wanted to call Daniel immediately, but I had watched him with Vanessa for 3 years, and I understood how it would go if I arrived with nothing but a second-hand account from a woman he barely knew. Vanessa was talented at reframing. She had done it before. Smaller things, nothing I could point to cleanly, just a pattern of conversations that ended with Daniel apologizing for something I had watched her start. I needed more than Patricia's word before I sat down with my son. I called Greg directly that evening. He confirmed everything Patricia had told me and added details she had not mentioned. Vanessa had described Daniel becoming aggressive at night. She had told Greg's wife she was scared to bring things up with him directly because of how he reacted when she tried. She had framed herself as a woman managing a difficult situation alone, too proud to ask for help but quietly reaching out to people who cared about Daniel. The performance of a worried wife who wanted only the best for her husband. The next morning, I drove to their house on Merritt Lane. Daniel answered before I knocked, already smiling, already holding 2 mugs. We sat at the kitchen table and I told him everything. I watched his face move through confusion, then a careful blankness, then something that looked like the beginning of anger before he pulled it back. He said Greg had probably misunderstood. He said Vanessa worried about him and sometimes expressed that worry in ways that came out wrong. His eyes were not quite focused on me while he spoke. They were somewhere in the middle distance, working through something he did not want to land on yet. I recognized that look. He had it as a teenager when he already knew the answer, but was not ready to say it out loud. Vanessa came downstairs while we were still talking. She was in her robe, hair loose, and she stopped in the doorway when she saw my face. There was half a second where something flickered in her expression before she arranged it into concern. She said she had been scared and had not known what else to do and had reached out to people because she needed support. Her voice stayed soft. She did not raise it once. And Daniel's whole body shifted toward her while she spoke. The unconscious lean of someone who has learned to orient themselves around another person's emotional state. I left without pressing further. I kissed Daniel on the cheek, told him I loved him, and said we would talk later. Vanessa walked me to the door and smiled pleasantly. I sat in my car on their street for a moment before pulling away, knowing I had just handed her a warning and that she would use it. I called Patricia that afternoon and asked if she had anything in writing. She had kept Vanessa's text from the beginning because the whole thing had felt strange, and she had wanted a record. She sent me screenshots that evening, 15 messages across 2 conversations. Vanessa had been specific and detailed in a way that was impossible to dismiss as casual concern. She described Daniel drinking before his morning commute. She described mood swings. She described an incident on a Sunday night where she said she had locked herself in the bathroom because she did not feel safe. None of it had happened. I printed the screenshots at the library the next morning because I wanted physical copies I could put in front of him. Then I called Marcus Webb, Not Daniel's supervisor, but his college roommate who had been a groomsman at the wedding. I asked if he had heard anything. He went quiet for a moment and then said Vanessa had called him about 3 weeks ago. She had been crying. She said she was at her wit's end and did not know who to turn to. He had believed her because why would he not? He had been watching Daniel carefully at their last group dinner, trying to detect a problem that was not there. I asked if he had told anyone else. He said he had mentioned it to their friend Colton because he was worried and thought maybe Colton had noticed something. Colton had then said something to his girlfriend who worked in the same building as Harlow and Reed. By the time I hung up, I had a clear picture of how deliberately Vanessa had constructed this. She had not called one person carelessly. She had chosen specific people in a specific order, people connected to Daniel's work life and his social circle, and she had delivered consistent details that would corroborate each other as the story spread. She had called people the same week Daniel submitted his formal application for the promotion. I showed Daniel the screenshots 2 days later on a Saturday morning when I knew Vanessa was at her sister's house. He opened the door in sweatpants and knew from my face immediately this was not a casual visit. We sat at the same kitchen table and I laid the printed pages out in front of him one at a time. He read through them without speaking. The kitchen was quiet except for the refrigerator hum and a lawnmower somewhere down the street. When he finished, he put the last page down and sat back and looked at the ceiling for a moment. I told him about Marcus Webb and Colton. I told him about the timeline. I asked him to think about whether Marcus Hale had seemed different toward him lately, whether there had been meetings where the energy shifted without explanation. He stared at the table and worked through it the way he always worked through things that hurt him, methodically and quietly, building toward the thing he did not want to arrive at. He called Marcus Hale that afternoon, not about the promotion, just a casual call, the kind that gives you information through texture rather than content. Marcus was warm but careful. There was something professional and managed in how he spoke that had not been there 4 months earlier. Daniel asked directly if he had heard anything concerning about him personally. There was a 4-second pause. Then Marcus said he had heard a few things that had given him pause, but that he hoped everything was fine at home. He said it gently, the way people speak when they have already decided something. Daniel came to my house that evening and sat on the couch for a long time without saying much. He said he had been trying to think of any version of this that was not what it looked like. He kept coming back to the fact that Vanessa knew his supervisor's name, knew his colleagues, knew the social dynamics of his workplace because he had shared all of it with her. He had come home and told her about office conversations, about the competition for the promotion, about who in leadership had influence over the decision. He had given her a map, and she had used it. Vanessa came home Sunday evening, and Daniel told me later that she had known immediately something was different. He put the printed screenshots on the kitchen counter and asked her to explain them. She looked at them for a long time. Then she sat down, placed her hands flat on the table, and said she had been scared of losing him. She said since the promotion process started, she had felt him moving toward a version of his life that did not include her. She had watched him come home energized and talk about his future, with an excitement that never seemed to involve her, and she had felt herself disappearing from his plans. She said it with tears running down her face and her voice completely steady, like she had been rehearsing the explanation for longer than she would admit. Daniel told her to go back to her sister's house. He called me Monday morning and told me what she had said. I listened without speaking until he was finished. He said the part that kept stopping him was not the promotion, even though it made him furious in a way he was still processing. It was that she had looked at Marcus Webb, his closest friend since they were 19 years old, and lied to his face about things she had invented. She had looked at Patricia and Greg, people who had wished him well at his own wedding, and handed them a story designed to damage him. She had done it carefully and deliberately. And then she had come downstairs in her robe and looked me in the eye and performed being a worried wife. I told him I was sorry. He said he knew I had had questions about her for a long time, and he was sorry he had not listened more carefully. I told him he did not need to apologize for trusting his wife. The promotion process had gone quiet in a way that answered every question without anyone saying a word. Daniel filed for separation the following month. He had met with a family attorney twice before he made the decision. He told me grieving the version of the marriage he thought he had was harder than the anger, because the anger had direction, and the grief just sat in the room with him. I understood that. Grief without a clean edge is its own kind of weight. Vanessa's attorney tried twice during the divorce proceedings to introduce a narrative about the state of Daniel's mental health during the marriage. Daniel brought the documentation, the screenshots, the timeline, the calls to Marcus Webb and Greg. That line of argument was dropped quickly. Marcus Webb called Daniel and apologized. He said he should have come to Daniel directly instead of letting the doubt sit. He said the drinking story had never quite felt right, but Vanessa had been so convincing he had suppressed the dissonance. Colton reached out a week later, more awkward in his apology but genuine. Daniel told him to just be present going forward. I watched my son forgive people during those months in a way that made me proud of him and sad for him at the same time, deciding how much grace to extend while still being honest about what had happened. The divorce was finalized 4 months later, cleaner than Daniel had feared because they had no children, and their finances had not been together long enough to become deeply tangled. Daniel brought his girlfriend Simone to my house for dinner nearly a year after the divorce was finalized. She was a structural engineer he had met through project collaboration at work. Direct, straightforward. She looked you in the eye when she asked how you were and meant it. She brought wine and helped clear plates without being asked and argued confidently with my brother about a football call with zero self-consciousness. Daniel watched her from across the table with the expression of someone who had chosen very carefully this time. After they left, I washed the dinner dishes and thought about the Wednesday afternoon when Patricia leaned over at a birthday lunch and changed everything. I thought about all the times over 3 years I had watched something in Vanessa and told myself I was being unfair, that my instincts were colored by a mother's possessiveness, that I was looking for reasons to distrust her. I thought about how close I had come to deciding the whole thing was not my place. I dried the last glass and put it in the cabinet where it belonged and turned off the kitchen light. Some things take longer to right themselves than they should, but they do right themselves eventually, if the people who see what is happening have the nerve to say it out loud.